In the NBA, we see players face injuries or even retire too early all the time, and be put into these situations where their eventual comebacks start to get highly anticipated because everyone wants to see that player come back and start playing like their old self. But it doesn't always happen, and when it didn't, it was what led to the 8 saddest comeback attempts in NBA history, which we're looking at today. And let's start with one more recent with Kobe Bryant. So before Kobe Bryant tore his Achilles in 2014, he was still highly considered to be one of the best basketball players on the planet. He was playing on what was supposed to be the league's biggest super team, and at 34 years old, he was still averaging 27 points per game and playing and dunking on people like he was 24. Everyone thought he was defying Father Time, and he capped it off by playing nearly 48 minutes a night in the last few games of the season to ensure that his struggling super team made it to the playoffs. But on April 12th, 2014, he tore his Achilles, and Father Time had caught up. It's a devastating injury that players usually don't come back from, but there was still hope that if anybody could do it, Kobe could. After his legendary career, players and fans hoped that he would come back just as good and continue to play better than he was expected, to play like the Kobe everyone knew. But that never happened, and his comeback and career after that injury was actually really tough to watch. And it didn't help that to start the next season, the Lakers gave him a 2-year contract extension for $48 million, making him the highest paid player in the league for those 2 years, even though he wasn't going to play at nearly that level. And that was controversial enough as is, but then he only played 6 games in 2014 before being ruled out for the rest of the year. And I always want to give respect to Kobe, but his last 2 years in the NBA weren't good at all. He basically had a 2-year farewell tour. While the rest of the Lakers roster was composed of young up-and-coming talent, they were overshadowed on and off the court by Bryant. So in 2015, he continued to suffer injury after injury, only played 35 games, and his last year was his official farewell tour, where he averaged 17 points a game, and nearly every game was a goodbye to him. Now I get paying respect to legends, but the team was basically on a standstill for 2 entire years, and him just getting injured, not playing like he used to, and getting constant criticism over his contract just made it all hard to watch. But then we'll stay in the Laker family for Magic Johnson. Now, as we know, Magic quickly became one of the greatest basketball players to ever play the game, and had a legendary career before contracting a certain kind of sickness of his own, and as they should have been, most people were ready for him to call it quits. So he did, and announced his retirement in 1991, but he tried to make a couple comebacks afterwards. Now, he still went on to famously play in the 1992 NBA All-Star Game and on the 92 Dream Team, and that inspired him to try to return for the 92 season, but eventually decided against it. In 96 though, at the age of 36, he got himself into phenomenal shape and actually made a return. He rejoined the Lakers playing power forward and led an average Lakers team to a 22-10 record in games that he played. He finished 12th in MVP voting and led his team to the 4th seed in the West, but they ended up losing 3 games to 1 in the first round, and he went straight back into retirement. Then he created something called Magic Johnson All-Stars, where he got a lot of former NBA players and went and played exhibition games against various teams around the world. And it was actually pretty popular and something that he did for a couple years before going to play for a Sweden team in 99. And I mean, it wasn't a terrible comeback. It could have been worse, but he just waited so long to get back into basketball when he was already 36. And I guess you could just say for Magic Johnson standards, it was underwhelming. You can't really say the same about Derrick Rose's comeback though, because overall it's been a success in most people's terms. But overall, for a while, the entire thing was one of the saddest things in the NBA I've ever seen. Of course, it all started when he tore his Achilles in the 2012 playoffs. And remember, at this time, he was the biggest up-and-coming star in the entire league. He had some people thinking he would be the next best player in the NBA because he was only 22, just won his first MVP, and led the Bulls to the best record. So right after his injury, all everybody wanted was for him to hurry back and get back to 100%. But little did we know that would never happen again. And it was really sad to watch a guy with that much potential get injured again and again and again, having to have 4 major surgeries on his knee, to the point where he said if he had one more big knee injury, he was gonna retire. And from a fan's perspective, just realizing the fact that he was never gonna be the same, and his body was never gonna be able to keep up with him playing the style that he did, the entire thing was pretty depressing to watch up until recently. The Bulls eventually had no choice but to give up and trade him, and that's when it was clear that he had become a role player. So he went to the Knicks, Cavs, and Timberwolves, and I'd say in 2018 for him was when things really started to turn back in his favor. He was able to stay semi-healthy and have a good year for them off the bench. He did the same the next year for the Pistons, and this past year in the playoffs for the Knicks, he proved that he was still an extremely valuable player to have on a roster. And to get there, it took him 9 entire years after his first ACL injury. So there's a semi-happy ending, but the process of the comeback was anything but that. Andrew Bynum had an even worse comeback attempt though, because, well, he he just ended up not ever coming back at all. And like Derrick Rose, this was another sad one because he was on his way to becoming one of the better players in the NBA and one of the best at his position. I remember at his peak when people were really debating whether him or Dwight Howard was the best center in the league. It seems crazy now, but at the time it was an actual conversation being had. And it's even crazier that Bynum was only ever a one-time All-Star. He was always huge for the Lakers though. They drafted him and he was a big piece in helping them win 2 championships. But every single season he played, he either had minor or major knee issues and always missed a lot of games. As a matter of fact, he only ever played more than 65 games once in his career. And in 2011, the Lakers knew this would be a problem, so they traded the 24-year-old star in that 4-way trade that got them Dwight Howard in return. And it was the smartest thing the Lakers could have ever done, because right after getting traded to Philly, he had a knee surgery and would never play a single game for them. And this was when his sad comeback attempt started. He was supposed to come back for Philly around the All-Star break that year, but re-injured his knee while bowling, and this is where things hit rock bottom and he really just became a meme. The next year though, he'd sign with the Cavs and get thrown out of one practice mid-season because he would shoot the ball every single time it touched his hands. So he got waived and signed with the Pacers, where he'd only play 2 games, before never getting picked up by another team again. But in 2018, 4 years later, even though he was only 30 years old, he tried to make a return to the NBA, but it never really ended up happening. And like, some of these are sad in terms of, oh, I feel so bad for them. This one, as you can tell, is sad in terms of just disappointing. I'd probably say the same though for Michael Jordan's comeback attempt. And he had 2, of course, his first with the Bulls, which was a success. We're obviously not talking about that one. We're talking about his Washington Wizards days. Now, if you know Jordan and the Bulls story or watched The Last Dance, you'd know that after their 6th championship, MJ wasn't even really done playing. Management wanted to break up the team, so he retired. And it was clear that he wasn't done because he came back 3 years later, but it didn't go very well at all. And there's a reason everyone tries to act like it didn't happen. So in 2000, just 2 years after retirement, Jordan became president of basketball operations for the Wizards, where they finished with a 19-63 record. He then infamously drafted Kwame Brown first overall and decided that he thought he could help the Wizards better on the court than off it. So he came out of retirement once again, and people had high hopes for this. But he came back and looked like a shell of his former self. He did help the Wizards to an improved 37-45 record, but they still missed the playoffs because he got a knee injury late in the season. Even when healthy though, he only put up 22-5-5 and even came off the bench for 7 games. Honestly, not bad for his age at the time, but it wasn't really what people were expecting. Then the next season he announced it was his last, averaging 26-3, finished with the same exact 37-45 record, missed the playoffs again, and retired once and for all, ending his career. Of course, his legacy is unmatched, but it would have just been slightly better had he never come back. Stephon Marbury, on the other hand, well, he kind of has an NBA legacy that's not the best to remember. He had his talent and everything, but a lot of attitude and off-court issues that led to his downfall, especially involving his NBA comeback. And his long feud with then Knicks head coach and president Isaiah Thomas really derailed his career. But Isaiah was eventually replaced, and Mike D'Antoni took his spot as coach and told Stephon that he wanted him to come off the bench but would still be able to play 35 minutes a game. Instead, Marbury felt offended, refused to, was then banned from attending Knicks practices and games, and reached a buyout with them soon after. So 2 months later, at 32 years old, he signed with the Celtics in what was thought of as his chance to redeem himself, now that he's away from all the distractions on the Knicks. But instead, it saw him playing 23 games, averaging 3 points and 7 assists a game. A lot of weird stuff happened in this man's career, and he had a chance to come back and make it right, but never did. At least he did just that though when he got to China. And speaking of China, that brings us to Yao Ming, who had one of the quickest failed comebacks of all time. Throughout his NBA career, he had dealt with a lot of injuries, and foot injuries bothered him his entire career and even started happening before he got to the NBA when he was in the CBA. Well, this one specifically happened in Game 3 of the second round in 2009 against the Lakers. The Rockets were looking great and the series was competitive, but when he got injured, it meant that Houston's season was basically over, and it was one that caused him to miss the entire 2009 and 10 season afterwards. But the next 2010 and 11 season finally came up, and at this time, Yao was still only 30 years old and in his prime. He was making his comeback after a year away, and the Rockets were excited, fans were excited, and everyone was excited. Well, only 5 games into the season, he developed a stress fracture in his left ankle, had to sit out the rest of that year, and retired officially at the end of it. So it was a very depressing and unsatisfying comeback. And what might have been the saddest comeback of all time probably goes to Greg Oden. Now, we all know his story, the only guy picked in the 2007 draft over Kevin Durant. He was picked first overall and almost immediately after became one of of the biggest busts of all time. He was drafted in 2007 and was waived by the Blazers in 2012, but within that time only played 82 games for them in a 5-year span because he just had so many knee injuries. The hype for Oden was real when he drafted, but he only ever played 2 seasons in the league before getting waived by the Blazers and taking a year off. In 2013 though, he took a chance and the Miami Heat signed him to a 1-year deal. Well, there he only played in a total of 23 games, played in 9 minutes each game, and averaged 2 points and 2 rebounds. And unsurprisingly, Miami was done with him after that. He tried for another comeback in 2015 though, working out for the Grizzlies, Mavericks, and Hornets, but nothing ever came of it, and that was officially the end of his NBA career, meaning the former first overall pick finished only ever playing 105 games in the league. It was sad for fans, sad for Oden, and especially sad for the Blazers.